Hello everyone, my name is Rob, welcome to Kinetic Rugby League. In this video I'll be giving you my Super League Round 10 power rankings. So there's a few interesting changes this week. In the middle there's a couple changes, and especially near the top there's a very interesting one. So we'll crack on with 12th place. Kicking things off with 12th place, and still in 12th place unfortunately, the London Broncos. There was a sort of small period a couple of weeks back I was thinking, right, well they can make some real progression, some decent results. Hull FC weren't really offering too much, but yeah, it's kind of gone back to normal. I still think there's a win in there somewhere. Could potentially happen this week. It's probably one of their best chances. I still like to think by the end of the season there's another competitive game in there somewhere. The only two they've had is against Hull FC, and Salford was somewhat competitive. But yeah, it's been a rough couple of weeks, a rough, whole season to be fair to them, but I'm still holding out hope that they can make something happen in a few weeks' time. But defensively, back to being poor. In attack, they've had some real bad performances. It's just about getting the basics right. They can get the basics right consistently week to week. They will come across a team that's on an off day, and they'll take a win at some point. But unfortunately, London Broncos in 12th place. Moving on to 11th place, and still in 11th place, I have Hull FC. They are still a very poor team in attack. They look really confused about what they want to do. Their execution is poor. They're just very clueless. In defence, there's been some resilient moments, like very, very few. There does seem to be a little bit more life in them since Tony Smith left than when he was at the club. That is something. That's a start. And there's always potential to rebuild with Richie Myler in his new role now. Simon Grix possibly delivering different speeches, just having a different voice sometimes is nice to kind of change the kind of vibe around the changing room. They've put in some, I don't even want to say okay. At least against Leeds, it was a respectable effort and were the better team for a lot of it. Against Warrington, there were some moments where they at least made Warrington struggle. But they're still a really poor team. Not as bad as the Broncos, but nowhere near the next team up. So Hull FC still in 11th. Moving on to 10th place now, and still in 10th place, Castleford Tigers. They've done a fantastic job to break out of that sort of bottom three that is now a duo on its own at the bottom. They're moving their way up. I gave them a little bit of credit going into the game against Leigh, thinking that I think 28-14 was a scoreline I went with. I gave them a little bit of credit thinking, well, Leigh's on the up at the moment, and they would have been like one of the worst teams they could have played because Castleford are on the up as well. But to be down and then to come back and to get a point out of that is actually brilliant. Absolutely fantastic for them. And they're really showing that, a few weeks ago where they started changing the performances, that it was to be taken seriously. I think it was probably since they beat Salford, I think that was maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, maybe 5, they have started to turn things around. And with the inclusion of Tex Hoy, he seems to have found a home that he's comfortable in and he can actually flourish and show what he is capable of. So that's a really good fit for them. And, I'm happy for them because they've had a few tough games, but they've also had some decent ones in there, and a lot of people wrote them off. But over the last couple of weeks, the last month especially, they've done a pretty good job. That gap to 9th isn't too far at all now. And I would say based on the team that's next, if they were to play them next week, which they don't, but if they were to, play them tomorrow, they'd give them a hell of a game. So Castleford could potentially see themselves going up next weekend, but we'll kind of see how the results and performances go. But they're not doing too bad. They're doing a pretty good job, actually. Moving on to 9th place, and still in 9th place, Leeds Rhinos. Yes, they, won by a very significant margin last time out, but, you just have to look at the opponent. Yes, it was by a more significant margin than I gave them credit for, but you got to take into account the performances over the last few weeks have been very lackluster. They are also a team that's very confused about what they want to do. My only positive towards Leeds is that because of the individuals they've got, there's a few times where they get thrown out of shape, and that's where they come alive, because then they have to play off the cuff, they have to create something from nothing, because they've got this really flat style that doesn't suit a lot of the players in that team, especially Brodie Croft. It doesn't really seem to suit him. But when they manage to get an offload and create a second phase, or when a player jams into a player very quickly on the defensive side, and then they escape the tackle, that defensive line is then out of shape, Leeds play off the cuff, and they respond from that, they react from it. They've got players that seem to actually switch into gear. So that's the biggest positive for me on the side of Leeds, but defensively still have the deficiencies in terms of controlling games, allowing momentum to change multiple times throughout a game is still a big issue. Again, individuals can create great moments, and they do have a strong squad overall, but in terms of performances, they need to pick it up soon. They've still got more than half a season to go to at least fight for playoffs, but as of right now, I'm losing a lot of trust in them week to week. Moving on to 8th place now, and moving down one are the Leigh Leopards. A little bit unfortunate, really, because they've been solid over the last couple of weeks, but they do need to make way for a team that's moving up, who we'll get on to next. But Leigh have been, they've been real solid the last couple of weeks. Decent performances. I think it's one of those against Castleford. There's two ways of looking at it. One is that they had control over the game, that they created plenty of opportunities, and they were fully in the driver's seat for that game against Castleford. So that's one way of looking at it. They created that. And then, of course, on the negative side, they completely lost it. They threw that one away. It will happen. It will happen with all teams. But I think over the last couple of weeks, that one you could maybe, you don't want to forgive them for it. But look, it will happen to everyone at some point. I think it may be the only game that they've kind of thrown away this season. And other teams will throw Leeds away. That will happen. But over the last couple of weeks in general, they've shown a lot of dominance, a lot of creativity. They're getting back to their usual starting 13. And they've kind of gone past that phase of ridiculous numbers of injuries. They've still got a few key players missing. I think John Asiata is out for a couple of weeks now. But they've done well to adapt. They've gone on over that wave of huge key players missing. And they will learn to adapt again to any new issues that arise for the rest of the season. So I think they're in a good place right now. Can really start to push on, compete against the better teams, get back to that form that they had early on and in the middle of last season, and really start putting some teams under pressure in the middle, and maybe even start competing towards the top once we get towards the back end of the season. But Leigh Leopards down one in 8th. Moving on to 7th place now, and also moving down one, I have the Huddersfield Giants. They're a team that has major consistency issues. I think they're still a solid team, so compared to what they were like the first, let's say, 5 weeks at least, this next phase of 5 games, they've been a lot more solid, a lot more consistent. I have a lot more trust in them to at least compete against the top teams. We saw against, St. Helens. I mean, they've not been perfect, but we saw against them, they could take the fight to them, and they threw that one away. But yeah, they're still very inconsistent at the moment. They are also a team that have great individuals like Leeds, but I don't think they rely on the off-the-cuff moments as much. They can kind of create those opportunities through the attacking style they have. Defensively, they're okay. My only concern with Huddersfield is I just don't think we know what Huddersfield team will get week to week. It's very up in the air, because I do kind of back them to at least compete against every team. So even against Wigan, Catalans, Saints, Hull KR, Warrington, they're probably, the top 5 really, but I trust them to compete against those teams week to week, but I just don't know what kind of Giants team we're going to get. So yeah, trust is a bit off at the moment, but they're still strong, still fighting. They've got, I think, just a few key players out at the moment. No, Chris Hill, I believe, is still out. Not sure how long he's out for, but yeah, Adam Clune is still going to take time to settle in. Jake Connor, my biggest issue with him is probably his kicking game, but he's offered a lot of great things, especially in attack. But they're learning. They're getting there. They'll build. They're a decent team. But yeah, trust is a bit shaky at the moment. Moving on to 6th place now, and moving up to, I have the Salford Red Devils. They've put in some terrific performances the last couple of weeks. I've had them to lose in the last 2 weeks, and they've won those games in the last 2 weeks. And they've been against solid opponents as well. Huddersfield, as I mentioned, yes or no, They have been inconsistent, but they're still a strong attacking team. Held them to, fairly low points relatively to how results have gone this season. And then Warrington, who were kind of on the up the last couple of weeks. So to beat two very solid teams in the middle of the pack, it's a strong statement. And they've been on some good form recently, but there was kind of the win against the London Broncos was an odd one. So they have been a little bit up and down in terms of performance, but the last 2 weeks they've really, really shown that they can compete against the sort of stronger teams in the middle. I do need to see them face the teams towards the top again, so put them under more strain, put them under more pressure, and see how they respond. But it's been really solid from them the last couple of weeks, and they're a team that's still going to adjust with a few things, changing. There's no Ackers anymore, there's no Brodie Croft. But that's one of the things is like how long should it take for a team to adapt? Should we think that, well, there's only 2 major changes and it's been 10 weeks, surely they should know, plus a pre-season, they should know how they want to play, what they want to look like, but there'll always be growing pains in there, and some teams, they need a full year to understand how they want to play and the sort of nuances of teammates, but they're a team a little bit like Huddersfield at the moment. I don't fully trust them because I also don't know what Salford team will get week to week, but I am trusting them a little bit more than Huddersfield right now, just because of recent form. I think they started out the season very well, had a slight dip. It's a very small dip. I think that was post the game against Wigan and then Leigh. And then they've just turned it around. And of that solid team that we knew, especially the attacking team that we knew from last season. But yeah, I think there's still some issues in attack and defence, only slightly. And they can be found out, especially if they're just off the mark a little bit. But they're turning things around and are overall a very solid team and can compete with pretty much anybody on their best day. On to 5th place now, and still in 5th place, I have the Warrington Wolves. They've been a tad off. I don't know if it's justifiable to move them down just yet, because the thing is, I think this week against Hull KR will be a great test. And it is possible that they'll move down, especially depending on how Salford do and then how Warrington do against Hull Kingston Rovers. 5th just feels about right at the moment, because it does feel that they are a tad off the top teams, but they're just doing a little bit more than those teams in the middle of the pack. And the gap to Salford is very small right now, just based on current form. The performance against Leigh was very sluggish, but when they actually cleaned up their act, that's when they turned things around in the game. They were a little bit sluggish against Hull FC, but I also said in a match reaction video on TikTok, link in description by the way, that I thought that was one of the best spine performances that Warrington had produced this season. And people might think that was a bit of an odd thing to say, but what I was referring to was the link up between Drinkwater and Williams and Dufty, and the way that they were able to create great field position on the edges and really, worried the centres and wingers and even second rowers of the Hull FC defence. You can go watch that video and it'll be more in depth about the performance, but that was a really strong spine performance, and I needed to see that, especially from Josh Drinkwater going into next week against such a strong opponent. It's been a bit off from Warrington, especially after that performance against Leeds and then Saints. It's been a little bit off. But no reason to panic just yet. All I need to see is just Warrington competing against Hull Kingston Rovers. It might not necessarily be a win, but I just need to see them competing, and that's at least a good marker that Warrington is still to be taken fairly seriously in the Challenge Cup, League Leaders Shield, Grand Final, all that good stuff. But yeah, I think there could be a change incoming, but it depends on a lacklustre performance against Hull KR, so we will see how that goes. On to 4th place now, and moving down one, I have the Catalans Dragons. They are a team that isn't without their issues. In terms of performances on the field, they've been pretty damn good some weeks, and they've been extremely poor in others. But they are a team that's had to deal with some changes to the spine. They dealt with it a lot more last year and dealt with it better. This year, there's a few issues. I just think defensively, they can be caught off guard. They competed well with Wigan for a good chunk of that first half, to be fair to them. And then just completely lost it, took their eye off the ball, and were then just dominated by a better team overall. The gap between them and Wigan, I don't think week to week isn't huge, but yeah, they were just beaten by a better team that they let get away with a lot of things. They're still strong, and I've got no worries about them. I think they'll be able to turn things around this week, and they'll still be competing for top 4, possibly even top 3 by the end of the season. But yeah, they for me, they're a little bit like Huddersfield and Salford in that I don't actually know what team we're going to get, but the lows are not as low as Salford and Huddersfield, and the highs are usually higher than Salford and Huddersfield, if that makes sense. So I just feel that they are a little bit inconsistent, but the highs and lows are a lot better than those other two inconsistent teams at times. But yeah, defensively, they've still got some issues that they need to work on. As I said, they're dealing with personnel issues that will happen to everybody, but they, week to week, seem to be hit with them the most in a lot of key positions, at least anyway. But yeah, some teams, they won't always be perfect year after year, and they'll have some issues because they were really solid last year, and it's difficult to live up to that. But yeah, they're still going strong. They'll still compete with most teams week to week. But yeah, just a few defensive things to sort out, and they'll be good. Moving on to third place now. And moving down one, I have St Helens. They have been pretty poor the last couple of weeks, and that all started from the game against Warrington in the Challenge Cup. Since then, you had the performance against Huddersfield where they were 12-0 down. Yes, they brought it back, so fair play, and won it towards the end of the game. But yeah, they've just been dominated in a couple of areas. They don't really have that sting that they used to have in attack. That scramble defence that I would praise them heavily for just doesn't seem to be as energetic as it used to be. Momentum can change very, very easily. And as we saw against Hull KR and against Warrington, is that teams now have the ability to dominate against them. You know, this is not the same looking Saints team that we've had the last 5 years. It's nowhere near. They still have a lot of those core players and great individuals. I know, Roby's gone, but to replace him with Darryl Clark is a great addition. I've not heard Saints fans say many bad things about him. I don't think they've got too many complaints. A lot of the complaints are on Paul Wellens at the moment. But that team's just not really firing. They're not clicking the same way. They don't have that aura, that vibe that they normally bring. Teams just aren't as afraid of them as they used to be. Teams gave Saints a lot of respect before the game even started and were afraid to really go at them. And then when Warrington was the first team to kind of do it, especially in the second half of the Challenge Cup, teams were thinking, you know what? We can put them on the ropes and we can actually go at them. And there are holes in that defence. And when you really test Saints, like you properly go at them with a lot of pace, they have been known to fold, especially over the last couple of weeks. In attack, as I said, still a bit clunky, and they don't really have as much, or seemingly don't have that same kind of firepower that they've had the last couple of years. I think most weeks they'll be fine. They'll still beat all the teams towards the bottom and in the middle. But yeah, it's getting real competitive towards the top, and they're just not handling it with the same kind of energy and flair that they've had over the past couple of years. And especially given last week's performance, they do deserve to move down. Moving on to second place now, and moving up to Hull Kingston Rovers. They have finally entered that top 2 debate. I think it was entirely possible for them to go number 1, given the fact that they beat Wigan and Saints back to back. If Wigan didn't put in such a dominant performance, like if they got battered by Catalans, KR fans, you're at number 1. But the fact that, we'll get on to number 1, but Hull KR, this is what I've been saying the last couple of weeks. If you've been watching my videos over the last month or so, even a bit more than that, I've been saying I want to see them tested against Saints and Wigan. Because we saw from performances, not necessarily just results, but we saw from performances that they are a team that we would like to take seriously. And I backed them against Catalans. That did not go well at all. But that is an outlier based on their results this season and performances. That's not typical of this Hull KR team. I finally got what I wanted, which is a test against Saints. I backed them. Against Wigan, I just went with Wigan because I thought that could go either way, but I didn't think it'd be that dominant. So the fact that it wasn't just a win, they didn't just, flip it on its head a little bit. They just completely demolished both teams and had complete control in those games, fully earned performances. So the gap to Wigan is tiny, and depending on how results go, like next week and the week after that, there's a potential number 1 spot in the power rankings for Hull Kingston Rovers, but they've done fantastic. I finally got the tests that I wanted them to take, and they passed, both with flying colours. A+ in both, or A*, whatever the grading system is now. The stupid 10. Is that it? Did I get it right? I don't know. But yeah, Hull KR done a fantastic job. There are probably still a few teams like Saints, when they meet Saints, and Wigan in the Challenge Cup, Warrington next week, Salford again, possibly I think they play them again, maybe even Huddersfield and Catalans again. They will be challenged. They will be found out in some areas, in some portions of the game, because they aren't a perfect team. Same with every other team, they're not perfect, but they're really firing right now, and they're strong on both sides of the ball. That's what's scary about them, is that they can put a ton of points past you, and they'll make it an absolute grind for you to score. So they're looking really scary on both sides. And they're staying fairly healthy so far this season. I think there was only one week, maybe 2, where Mikey Lewis was missing, and they dealt with that really well, and that included the 40-0 win against Salford in the Challenge Cup. So yeah, they're looking really good right now. And as I said, the gap to first is tiny. Finally, in first place, and still in first place, Wigan Warriors. For me, the main reason why they've kept this number 1 spot, because they could have really lost it depending on how the performance went, but because they were solid against Catalans and dominant, that's why they kept the number 1 spot for now. As I said, the gap to Hull Kingston Rovers is pretty small right now, and depending on how results go next week, things could change, or over the next couple of weeks anyway. But, it was a pretty tight game for a good chunk of that match against Catalans, but then to really regain, just execute really well, and then to dominate from a lot of that second half is a testament, especially to the individuals that they've got and the way that they're coached, because you can never really write off Wigan, because even if you think you're in that game, just you wait. But of course, they aren't without their issues. They've had some poor defensive displays. I think one of the sort of weirdest ones was probably against London Broncos, like a month or so ago, over a month ago. They conceded 22 points. They put 60 past them, but I feel like 22 points, even with a few key players missing, against a London Broncos team that had been really poor around that stage, for me just wasn't really acceptable, given my expectations of Wigan at the time. The performance overall against Salford wasn't particularly great. And then being dominated against Hull Kingston Rovers. They're not a perfect team. No one this year is a perfect team. But I just think that their potential to change the flow of a game instantly is unmatched at the moment. So if, of all the teams in this league, if there's a team where it's very tight at half-time, or they're losing by a bit, or by a significant margin, the one team that I think can make up that is Wigan. Obviously, I know Castleford did it last week, but the one team that I would never write off, even if it's an 18-0 lead or 18-point lead, is Wigan, because they've got that firepower to come back. So, just as of right now, that performance against Catalans is keeping them at number 1, but things could really change next week. So that's going to be it for my Super League Round 10 power rankings. If you have your own power rankings, do let me know in the comments down below. Is there anything I've missed out? Have I been unfair about anything that I've not really considered? Do let me know your thoughts. But yeah, that's going to be it Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.